A 71-year-old woman with hands too swollen to reach an octave sat on a piano bench with no piano inside a house that hadn't seen a living soul in 60 years. She'd bought the place for $12. The whole town called it haunted. Neighbors crossed the street rather than walk past the front gate. But what none of them knew was that behind a sealed wall on the third floor, something had been waiting for exactly her hands, for exactly this moment, for 60 years. Before we go any further, if stories like this one mean something to you, take a second and subscribe. You won't want to miss what Henry and Evelyn find behind that wall. 2 weeks before any of that, before the auction, before Caulfield, before the house on Prosper Street, Henry Marsh stood in the kitchen of the home he had lived in for 42 years and watched his eldest son tape a for sale sign to the front window. Garrett didn't look up from his phone. His thumb moved across the screen while the tape dispenser made a thin, screeching sound against the glass. The sign was crooked. Henry noticed that. 40 years of checking plumb lines had made it impossible not to. Garrett's voice came flat, already finished with the conversation before it started. "It's already done, Dad. The buyer closes Friday." Henry held a coffee mug in both hands. The mug said, "World's Best Grandpa." His 3 grandchildren had given it to him when the youngest was 4. That girl was in college now. She hadn't called since Christmas. The mug had a small chip on the rim that Henry drank around every morning out of habit, the way you learn to work around the broken parts of things you love. He set the mug on the counter. "Your mother's piano is in the living room. The movers will deal with it." "She's had that piano for 31 years, Garrett. And the buyer doesn't want it." Garrett finally looked up. He had the face of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in his car on the drive over and was now delivering it exactly as planned. No pauses. No room for questions. "Dad, we talked about this. The equity in this house is the only retirement plan you two have. Split 3 ways, it gives each of us enough to manage things." Henry heard the word "each of us," not you and Mom, not your retirement, each of us. The money was already divided in Garrett's head, 3 clean portions, none of them belonging to the 2 people who had earned it. Upstairs, Evelyn was packing. She had been up there for 2 days, fitting 42 years of marriage into suitcases. Henry could hear her footsteps moving between the bedroom and the hallway closet, the soft thud of drawers opening and closing, the particular silence that fills a house when someone is deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. 42 years in this house. The pencil marks on the kitchen door frame where they'd measured the kids every September. The squeaky 3rd step on the staircase that Henry had never fixed because Evelyn said she liked it, it told her when someone was coming. The garden out back, where she'd grown tomatoes every summer until the arthritis made kneeling impossible. All of it came down to what would fit in 2 bags and the trunk of their Buick. Garrett left an hour later. He said his siblings would work something out about where Henry and Evelyn could stay. A temporary arrangement, a few weeks, maybe a month. He said it the way people say things they don't intend to follow through on, with confidence and no eye contact. Nobody worked anything out. Their daughter Rebecca lived 40 minutes away in a house with 4 empty bedrooms. She picked up the phone on the 2nd ring. Her voice was careful and measured, the voice of someone who already knew what she was going to say. "It's just not good timing, Dad. We've got the kitchen renovation starting next week, and Paul's mother might be coming to stay for a while, maybe in a month or two when things settle down. 4 empty bedrooms, a kitchen renovation. Henry thanked her and hung up. Their second son was simpler about it. He changed his phone number. No conversation, no explanation. Just a text from the old number that arrived 2 days before the line went dead. You and Mom should look into senior communities. There are good ones. I'll send some links. He never sent the links. Garrett's assistant, not Garrett. His assistant emailed them a list of subsidized housing options. 7 facilities. The shortest wait list was 18 months. Henry sat in the driveway of what used to be his home on the last afternoon it belonged to them. The new owner's realtor had asked them to be out by 5. It was 4:30. The trunk was loaded. The back seat held 2 boxes of kitchen things Evelyn couldn't part with, a cast-iron skillet that had been her mother's, a set of mixing bowls, a wooden spoon worn smooth on one side from 30 years of stirring in the same direction. He counted the money in his wallet. $340. He counted it twice because the first time he couldn't believe it was right. 40 years of work, a career that had certified the structural integrity of bridges and hospitals and schools, and this was what he had in his hand, $340, and a Buick with 160,000 miles on it. Evelyn sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap. Her knuckles were swollen at every joint, the skin stretched tight and shiny over the bone. The arthritis had ended her piano teaching 5 years ago. It had taken the thing she was best at and closed it off quietly, the way a door shuts in a room you're not standing in. You don't hear it happen, you just find it locked later. Her voice came soft, not afraid, just honest. "Where do we go?" Henry turned the key in the ignition. East. He didn't know why he said east. There was nothing east of them that he knew of. No relatives, no friends, no plan. But west was where Garrett lived, north was Rebecca, and south was the son, who had stopped answering. So east was what was left, and sometimes the only direction that makes sense is the one nobody's standing in. They drove for 3 hours through flat farmland and small towns that all looked the same from the highway, grain elevators and church steeples and gas stations with hand-painted signs. The afternoon light moved across the fields in long golden sheets, and Evelyn watched it from the passenger window without saying much. She had her hands in her lap the whole drive, the way she always held them, now still protected, like something she was carrying that might break if she moved too fast. They ended up in Caulfield because they needed gas, and it had the first station they'd seen in 20 miles. It was one of those towns that had been something once. A main street with a hardware store, a diner, a post office, and a church with a tall white steeple that caught the late afternoon sun. Half the storefronts sat empty. The population sign said 2,000, but the sign looked like it hadn't been updated since the number was true. They parked on Main Street because Evelyn needed a restroom, and the only place open at 3 in the afternoon was a diner called Rose's. A woman behind the counter looked up when they came in. She was about 60, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and a coffee pot in each hand, one regular, one decaf, like she'd been standing there waiting for exactly this moment. "Regular or decaf?" Henry hesitated. "Just the restroom, if that's all right. Sit down first. I'll bring you both a cup. You look like you've been driving a while." Her name was Rose Harding. She'd owned the diner for 30 years. The linoleum was worn thin in a path between the counter and the kitchen, and the menu board above the register still listed prices in handwriting that hadn't changed since the 90s. She brought them coffee and 2 slices of blueberry pie without being asked, and when Henry reached for his wallet, she shook her head. First-timers eat free. Henry looked at her. Is that a real policy? It is now. That was how they found the town, not by plan or map, not by GPS or recommendation. A woman with 2 coffee pots and a policy she made up on the spot because 2 strangers walked in looking like they had nowhere else to be. Henry saw the auction notice taped to the bulletin board by the restroom door. A single sheet of paper, county letterhead, typed in a font that meant business. Caulfield County Tax Auction, Saturday, 10 a.m., County Courthouse, 13 properties. He read the list while Evelyn finished her pie. Most were empty lots. A few were houses in various conditions of collapse. 1 had burned. 2 were little more than foundations with grass growing through the concrete. At the bottom of the list, 14 Prosper Street, Victorian, circa 1890. Condemned, no utilities. Structural assessment unknown. Minimum bid $12. Henry read that line 3 times. He said it out loud, mostly to himself. $12 for a house. Rose appeared behind him with a coffee refill. She moved through her own diner the way water moves through a creek bed. No wasted motion, always where she needed to be. That's the Bellingham place. Been empty since old Clara died. 60 years, give or take. Kids around here call it haunted. Is it? Rose shrugged. Every old house makes noises. People hear what they want to hear. Henry looked at Evelyn across the counter. Evelyn looked at the flyer. Something passed between them that didn't require words, the kind of conversation that 51 years of marriage makes possible without a single syllable. Evelyn's voice came quiet, careful, the voice of someone stating a fact she wished weren't true. We don't have anywhere else to go. I know. $12, Henry. I know. She took another bite of pie. She set her fork down. It's probably terrible. Probably. Let's go look at it. The auction was the next morning. The county courthouse smelled like floor wax and burnt coffee. About 30 people sat in metal folding chairs facing a long table where a woman in a grey blazer read property descriptions off a clipboard with the enthusiasm of someone reading a phone book. The lots went first. A man in overalls bought 3 for $15 each. A young couple bid on a half-acre near the creek. A landlord from 2 towns over picked up a pair of small houses for renovation. Then the auctioneer turned a page. 14 Prosper Street. She read the description flat. Victorian residence, approximately 4,000 square feet. 3 stories plus a tower, condemned by the county in 1991. No water, no electric, no gas. Roof status unknown. Foundation status unknown. Starting bid $12. A man in the 3rd row turned around and grinned at the room. That's the haunted house. People laughed. A few shook their heads. The auctioneer waited with the patience of someone who had done this before and expected exactly this result. Silence settled over the folding chairs like dust. She picked up her pen to mark it unsold. Henry raised his hand. The room went quiet, not gradually, all at once, the way a theater goes dark when the lights cut. Every head turned, 30 people looking at a 74-year-old man in a flannel shirt with $340 to his name, $12 for the house. The auctioneer looked at him over her glasses. "Sir, you understand this property is condemned. The county makes no guarantees about structural integrity, habitability, or safety." "I understand. There are no utilities connected. You would need to petition the county for reconnection, and that requires a structural certification from a licensed engineer." Henry's voice came steady, the way a beam holds steady when the load is properly distributed. "I'm a licensed structural engineer, retired." The auctioneer blinked. She looked at her clipboard, then back at him. $12 to the gentleman in the back. Nobody challenged the bid. Nobody even considered it. Henry walked up to the table, signed 3 pages of paperwork, and received a single key on a plain metal ring. The auctioneer shook his hand. Her mouth said good luck, but her eyes said something closer to God help you. They drove to the house with the windows down. Prosper Street was lined with old elms that had probably been planted when the houses were built, their branches meeting overhead in a canopy that filtered the morning light into shifting green patterns on the pavement. Most of the homes along the road were small, well-kept, with gardens and fenced yards, except the last one. The Victorian sat at the dead end, separated from its nearest neighbor by an empty lot, overgrown with goldenrod and thistle, 3 stories of wood frame architecture, a tower on the southeast corner, and a wrap-around porch that sagged badly on the left side where a support post had given way. The paint had peeled down to bare wood in long curling strips, like the house was shedding its own skin. One window in the tower was broken, and a bird had built a nest in the gap. The yard was more weed than grass, more memory than garden. Henry parked at the curb and got out. He stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets and didn't move for a full minute. He was reading the house the way he'd read 10,000 structures in his career, not with his eyes alone, but with something deeper, the instinct that 40 years of engineering had turned into a kind of language between him and buildings. He walked up the front steps, testing each one with his weight before committing to it. He put his hand flat against the nearest porch column, fingers spread wide, feeling for the vibration that tells you whether wood is solid or hollow, alive or gone. Then he looked up at the roofline, then down at the foundation stones visible through the gaps where the lattice had fallen away. "The bones are good, Evie." Evelyn was still in the car, watching through the windshield. "You can tell that from the porch." "I can tell that from the porch. The key fit the front door after some persuading. The lock was rusted, but the mechanism still turned the quiet click of something opening for the first time in 60 years. The door swung inward, and the smell came first. Dust, old wood, something faintly sweet that might have been dried flowers, left in a vase so long ago that only the ghost of their scent remained. The foyer was dark, until Henry found a window and forced the shutter open. Sunlight fell across a hardwood floor buried under decades of dust, and for a moment the dust itself was beautiful, a fine golden haze, hanging in the light like the house was breathing for the first time in 6 decades. A staircase rose along the left wall, solid oak, the banister carved and still intact. Straight ahead, a parlor with a bay window. To the right, a dining room with a stone fireplace, the mantel still holding a row of small ceramic figures, too dust-covered to identify. Evelyn walked in slowly. She ran her finger along the staircase railing and left a clean line in the grey. Her voice came almost to herself. "It's a real house. I mean, it's not a ruin. Someone lived here. Someone cared about this place." Henry was already checking the structure. He tapped walls, listening for the sound of rot. He found the cellar stairs off the pantry and went down with a flashlight for 10 minutes. When he came back up, he was nearly smiling, and Evelyn hadn't seen that face in a long time. Oak framing throughout. Stone foundation, no visible cracks. The porch needs rebuilding, and the roof has maybe 3 soft spots near the chimney, but the core structure is sound. Whoever built this house built it to stand for 200 years, and we got it for $12. We got it for $12. That first night they slept in the parlor on sleeping bags from the thrift store on Main Street. No electricity, no running water. A battery lantern sat between them, throwing a circle of yellow light against the plaster ceiling. The house made noises after dark creaks and pops, a low groan that traveled through the walls when the wind shifted. Henry lay on his sleeping bag, eyes open. "It's not ghosts." Evelyn's voice came from the dark beside him, patient and warm. "I know it's not ghosts, Henry. Wood contracts when the temperature drops at night. The exterior walls cool faster than the interior structure, and you get differential stress across the framing. The house is just adjusting. I have been married to you for 51 years. I know how houses breathe." He smiled in the dark. Even now, after everything, she could still do that to him. She couldn't sleep. The floor was hard, her hip ached, and the house was still a stranger. Sometime after midnight, she got up and walked through the first floor with the lantern, not searching for anything, just learning the shapes and corners of the rooms, the way you learn a new neighborhood by walking it 1 block at a time until it stops feeling foreign and starts feeling like something you could belong to. She ended up in the back corner of the parlor. The lantern light caught something she'd missed during the day, a piano bench, oak simple with a hinged lid, no piano anywhere near it, but the bench sat on the hardwood floor, and pressed into the wood around it were 4 circular dents where piano legs had stood for years, maybe decades, the ghost of an instrument that was gone. Evelyn sat down on the bench. She lifted the lid, empty inside except for a layer of fine dust and a single piece of yellowed cloth folded neatly at the bottom. She closed the lid and sat with her hands in her lap. She spread her fingers slowly, feeling each joint resist. The right hand was worse. Her index and middle fingers bent to about 60 degrees before the pain stopped them. Her ring finger barely moved at all. The thumb still had strength, but even that had stiffened over the past year. She shaped her hands into the position for a C major chord thumb on C pinky on the G above, the simplest chord in the world. Her fingers couldn't reach the span, not even close. She had taught piano for 30 years. She had been good at it, not a performer, never famous, but a teacher who understood how to move music from her hands into someone else's. Her students had won state competitions. One earned a scholarship to Juilliard. Another played with a symphony, now somewhere out west. And then the arthritis came. Slowly at first, then fast, the way a crack in a wall starts as a hairline, and then one morning the whole section gives way. She woke up one day and her fingers wouldn't close far enough to reach an octave. That was the end of it. Not a dramatic ending, just a quiet one. She stopped teaching. Nobody made a fuss about it. The piano sat in the living room untouched until Garrett sold it for $75 to a second-hand shop on Route 9. She hadn't cried when Garrett sold the house. She hadn't cried when her son changed his number. She hadn't cried when Rebecca said the timing wasn't good. She cried now, quietly in the dark, sitting on a piano bench with no piano, in a house full of dust and 60 years of silence. She cried the way old pipes leak, not a burst, just a slow, steady release of something that had been building pressure for a long time. Henry found her there at first light. He didn't say anything. He sat beside her on the bench, and they watched the morning come through the bay window and fill the parlor with the first sunlight this room had seen in 6 decades. The light moved across the floor like a hand wiping dust from a table, slow and steady and thorough. The next morning, Rose Harding stood on the porch, holding a wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth. She had a rain jacket over one arm, even though the sky was perfectly clear. Saw the lights last night. First time in 60 years that house has had a light on. Battery lanterns. Still counts. Inside the basket, 6 blueberry muffins, a thermos of coffee, 2 red apples, and a block of cheddar cheese wrapped in wax paper. Don't argue with me. I made too many muffins this morning, and I need somebody to eat them before they go stale. Rose looked at the two of them standing in that dusty foyer, 2 people in their 70s who'd just spent the night on sleeping bags in a condemned house they'd bought for $12. She didn't mention pity or sadness. She said, "My restroom is open any time. Same with the kitchen if you need to heat something up. I open at 6. Rose, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to. That's why I'm offering." They sat on the front porch steps and ate the muffins and drank the coffee. The morning was cool and quiet. A few birds worked the overgrown yard. Down the street a screen door opened and someone let a dog out. Evelyn set her a coffee on the step beside her. "Tell us about this house." Rose poured herself a cup from the thermos and settled in. Clara Bellingham, music teacher, piano mostly, gave lessons in this very parlor for years. Her husband Walter was career Army. He died in Korea in 52. Clara raised their daughter Margaret by herself after that. Margaret. Evelyn repeated the name as though she were learning a new chord. Rose nodded. That girl was something. She played piano at the state fair when she was 12, and people drove from 2 counties over to hear her. My mother used to talk about it. She said you could hear Margaret practicing from the sidewalk on summer evenings when the windows were open and people would stop and stand there and just listen. She was that good. She was that good. Clara had her lined up for conservatory. Everything was in place. Rose stopped. She looked at the coffee in her cup. What happened? Pneumonia. She was 19. It was fast. Clara was not alone one day, and Margaret was gone the next. Evelyn looked up at the 3rd-floor windows. The glass was dark behind the grime. Rose continued quieter now. Clara sealed up the 3rd floor. My mother said she had the door nailed shut, then plastered over it. She couldn't bear to look at it. After that, she stopped teaching, stopped going to church, stopped answering the door. She lived on the 1st floor by herself until she died in her sleep at 67. The mail carrier noticed letters piling up and called the sheriff. Rose paused. The obituary was 2 inches long. The last line read, "Survived by no one." Evelyn held her coffee with both hands and didn't drink. survived by no one. 3 words that fit in a newspaper column and carried the weight of an entire life disappearing without a trace. That afternoon, while Henry measured the porch for repairs, Evelyn walked to the library. It was in a brick building on Main Street that used to be a church, and inside it still smelled like old hymnals. The librarian pulled cardboard boxes from a back room. Nobody ever asked for local history, she said, and Evelyn found what she was looking for in the second box. A yellowed clipping from the Caulfield Gazette, 1954. The headline, "Local Girl Wins First Place at State Piano Competition." Below it, a photograph on cheap newsprint, grainy but clear enough, a young woman at a concert, grand hands on the keys, chin slightly lifted, a small, confident smile. Evelyn held the clipping with both hands. She could see the posture, the hand position, the way the girl held her wrists level and relaxed. A trained pianist who had gone beyond her teacher. In the same box, she found 2 more clippings. One was a photograph of the Victorian, taken in the 40s, paint fresh flower boxes in every window, a young woman in an apron standing on the porch, Clara Bellingham, alive and smiling on the same porch Henry was rebuilding right now. The other was from 1963, an obituary, 2 inches long, just as Rose had said. Clara Bellingham, aged 67, piano teacher, widow of Corporal Walter Bellingham, killed in action, Korea, 1952, preceded in death by her daughter, Margaret Ann Bellingham, 1958, survived by no one. Evelyn put the clippings back and sat in the quiet library for a long time, thinking about a house that outlived everyone who loved it. That evening, Evelyn told Henry what she'd found. They were sitting on the porch steps, the last light draining from the sky, the house darkening behind them. She was a pianist, Henry, a real one. I saw her hands in the photograph, the way she held them. That girl had a gift. She paused. And then she died at 19, and Clara sealed her room and lived alone until she died. Henry didn't say anything. He listened the way he always listened to Evelyn, completely, without the need to fix anything. There's a room upstairs with a dead girl's belongings in it, and I'm sitting on a bench that used to belong to a piano I can't play anymore, and somehow we ended up here. Henry put his arm around her shoulders. She leaned into him. First thing tomorrow, we open that wall. First thing. Meanwhile, a kid had shown up. Tommy Reeves, 17, tall and thin, baseball cap, pulled low work boots that had seen real use. He lived 4 houses down with his grandmother, who was 78 and on oxygen. He'd dropped out the year before to take care of her. He stood at the end of the front walk, watching Henry measure the porch railing for nearly 10 minutes before he spoke. "You need help with that?" Henry looked up from his tape measure. "Depends. You know how to hold a level. I know which end goes up." "That's a start. Come here." They worked together 3 days on the porch. Henry didn't lecture. He showed Tommy how to measure, how to mark a cut line, how to check for level. When Tommy got a measurement wrong, Henry didn't correct him. He just said, "Check it again." Tommy checked. "Off by a 1/4 inch." "So what do I do, To?" "Shim it. A 1/4 inch is a shim, not a new board. You waste material on a 1/4 inch, you'll run out of lumber before you run out of house." Then Henry held up the old yellow level he'd bought for $3 at the hardware store. "See that bubble? When it sits dead center between the lines, the surface is true, the world is straight. And when it's not centered, something needs adjusting. The level doesn't lie, Tommy. It's the most honest tool you'll ever hold." Tommy nodded. He understood that kind of thinking. He'd been running a household on almost nothing for over a year. Waste was the enemy. A quarter-inch was a shim. Henry was up before dawn the morning they planned to open the wall. He had the tools laid out on the third-floor hallway by the time Evelyn came up the stairs with 2 mugs of coffee, a hammer, a pry bar, a cold chisel, a flashlight. Tommy arrived at 7. He looked at the wall. "There's really a room back there. There's really a room." "How do you know?" "Pine baseboard. Everything else in this house is oak. The wallpaper pattern is close, but the repeat is off by half an inch. And I can feel air coming through." Henry picked up the chisel. Ready. Born ready. The first blow opened a crack in the plaster. A cloud of fine white dust billowed out. The second blow widened it. Each strike peeled back another layer, plaster, then lath, then a gap of empty air, and behind it, visible in the flashlight beam, through the broken wall, the surface of a door. Henry cleared enough plaster and lath to expose the full thing. A heavy oak door, 6 panels darker than the rest of the woodwork, a brass knob, tarnished nearly black, a brass keyhole. The knob turned, but the door didn't move. Locked. Henry ran his hand along the top of the doorframe, feeling the narrow ledge of molding where dust had gathered for decades. His fingers brushed something small and metal, a key, brass-old, coated in grime with a simple notched blade. Clara had sealed this room. She had plastered over the door and hidden it behind a false wall, but she had left the key right there an inch above the frame where anyone who broke through would find it. She couldn't go in, but she couldn't lock it away forever either. Henry fitted the key into the lock. It resisted, then turned with a click that echoed in the still hallway like a heartbeat starting up after a long silence. He pushed the door open. A rush of stale air came through cool and dry, carrying a smell different from the rest of the house. Not dust and old wood, something closer to paper and varnish and dried flowers pressed between the pages of a book nobody had opened in 60 years. The room was larger than they expected. It ran the full width of the house on the east side, with 2 tall windows that looked out over the street. Both windows were intact, the glass streaked with decades of grime, but unbroken. Morning light filtered through in pale golden bars that fell across the floor and lit the dust they'd stirred into slow drifting constellations. In the center of the room, covered by a white cotton sheet that had yellowed with age, was a shape they all recognized immediately. A grand piano. Along the walls, on every flat surface, stacked on chairs on the floor, on a low bookshelf under the windows, were piles of paper, sheet music, handwritten, ink on staff paper, hundreds of pages. Against the far wall stood a writing desk, small walnut with a single drawer and a slanted top. On the desk, placed precisely in the center, was a sealed envelope. Nobody spoke. The room had the feeling of a place that hadn't been abandoned. It had been prepared, arranged, left exactly this way on purpose, by someone who believed that someday someone would stand in this doorway and see it. Evelyn's voice came barely above a whisper. This was Margaret's room. Henry walked to the desk and picked up the envelope. On the front, in careful handwriting that had faded to a light brown, were 4 words, "To whoever finds this." He looked at Evelyn. She nodded. Henry opened the envelope, carefully sliding his thumb under the flap. The paper was brittle, and a small piece of the corner broke off and drifted to the floor like a leaf. Inside were 2 pages written in the same careful hand as the front of the envelope. He read the letter aloud. Tommy leaned against the door frame. Evelyn stood beside the piano with one hand resting on the yellowed sheet. My name is Clara Bellingham. I am writing this letter in February of 1959, 1 year after the death of my daughter, Margaret Ann Bellingham, who was 19 years old. Henry's voice was steady. He read the way he worked, measured, precise, giving each word its full weight. Margaret was a pianist. That is not enough to say. Margaret was music itself. She heard things in the silence that the rest of us could not. She played her first recital at 8. She won the state competition at 12. By 15, she had been accepted to the conservatory in Cincinnati on full scholarship. He turned the page. In the fall of 1955, when she was 16, Margaret was in an accident. A horse cart on the county road lost a wheel and struck her on the left side. Her left hand was badly injured. The doctor said she would regain most of the use, but the fine motor control, the speed and precision that a concert pianist requires, would not come back fully. Evelyn's hand tightened on the sheet covering the piano. Margaret did not stop. She did not complain. She sat at this piano the day she came home from the hospital with her left hand bandaged and swollen, and she began to compose. What she wrote was unlike anything I had ever heard. She composed music for hands that could not do what healthy hands could do. Wider fingerings, simplified chord voicings that still sounded full and rich, pieces that a pianist with limited strength and reduced reach could play without pain and without the music suffering for it. She said she was writing for every pianist who had been told they could not play any more. Henry paused. He looked at Evelyn. She was looking at the piano. She composed for 3 years, over 40 pieces for solo piano, several for piano and violin, a few for small ensembles, each one annotated in her own hand with notes about the adapted fingerings and the reasons behind each choice. He swallowed. Margaret died of a pneumonia on March the 14th, 1958. She was 19 years old. It happened in 4 days. She was composing at this desk on a Monday, and she was gone by Friday. Tommy shifted in the doorway. He was looking at the floor. I have sealed this room because I cannot bear to enter it, but I cannot destroy what she created. It is all I have left of her, and it is all she left of herself. Henry read the next section more slowly. In the drawer of this desk, you will find a bank book. I have placed $800 in a trust account at the savings bank in town. It is Walter's insurance settlement and every dollar I had. I have asked that it remain in the account until someone finds this room. If the bank honors my request, the money should have grown by then. The money is for this house and for music education, for those who need it most. He read the last lines quietly. If you are reading this letter, then someone has opened this room. I do not know who you are or how you found it, but I believe you were meant to find it. Please, let the music live. He folded the letter and placed it back on the desk. His hands were steady, but his jaw was tight, the muscles working beneath the skin in a way Evelyn had only seen a few times in 51 years. Tommy hadn't moved from the doorway. He was looking at the stacks of sheet music with an expression that Henry recognized, the look of someone doing math in his head, calculating the weight of what was in front of him. Evelyn was crying, not making a sound. Tears ran down her face, and she didn't wipe them away. She stepped forward. She took hold of the yellowed sheet with both hands and pulled it off in one slow motion. The fabric slid to the floor in a pile of faded cotton. The piano was a Steinway, Model B, 7 feet long, ebony case. The finish was dull from decades of still air, but the wood was intact. No cracks, no warping. The room had been sealed tight enough that the temperature and humidity had barely shifted in 60 years. Clara had preserved her daughter's piano better than any museum could have. Evelyn lifted the fallboard. The keys were yellowed ivory, the sharps a deep aged brown. She pressed middle C with her index finger. The note came out slightly flat, with a soft muffled quality, but it came out. The hammer struck the string vibrated, the soundboard amplified the tone. "It needs tuning," she said, "but it works." She sat down on the bench, a real piano bench this time, with a cushioned top matching the Steinway. She adjusted her position the way she had 10,000 times before at her own piano, the one Garrett had sold without telling her. On the music stand above the keys, someone had left a composition open. The title was written in Margaret's handwriting at the top of the first page, "For Hands That Remember." Evelyn read through the first 8 bars. Her eyes moved across the staff lines and her lips parted. "Henry, the fingerings, look at the fingerings." Henry didn't read music, but he could see what she was pointing at. Numbers above and below the notes, penciled in neat, deliberate script. These aren't normal fingerings. The intervals are wider. She's using the thumb and second finger, where standard arrangement would use the 4th and 5th. The chord voicings are spread differently. Evelyn's voice was shaking now, not with sadness, but with something closer to disbelief. She designed these for someone with limited reach in the ring and pinky fingers. Evelyn placed her hands on the keys, her swollen knuckles, her stiff joints, the fingers that hadn't reached an octave in 5 years. She played the first chord. It sounded full, open, rich, and her fingers reached every note. She played the second chord, then the third, then the first phrase. The melody rose from the old piano thin, slightly out of tune, but clear, warm and simple on the surface, building in complexity as it moved forward, and Evelyn's hands followed it. Her fingers found every note because Margaret had put every note exactly where damaged hands could reach. She played the first page, turned to the second and played that. Her eyes were wet, but her hands were steady. The music filled the sealed room and spilled through the open door down the hallway, down the staircase, through the bones of the house. She played for 10 minutes, 3 of Margaret's compositions, sight-reading them from the yellowed pages, each one written for hands like hers, not simplified, not dumbed down. Full, complex, beautiful music arranged so that a pianist with arthritis or injury or age-stiffened joints could play it without pain and without compromise. When she finally stopped, the silence was different from the silence that had been there before. Before it was the silence of a sealed place. Now it was the silence of a place that had been opened. If you've made it this far into Henry and Evelyn's story, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Tommy counted the compositions that afternoon, moving carefully through the room, sorting pages into groups by title. Each piece had a title page in Margaret's handwriting. He made a pile on the floor for each one. 43, he said. 43 complete compositions, 31 for solo piano, 7 for piano, and violin 3 for piano, and cello 2 for small ensemble piano, a violoncello, and flute. 43 pieces in 3 years, Evelyn said. She was working fast, Henry said. She knew her hand was getting worse. She was writing as fast as she could for as many people as she could before she ran out of time. Henry went to the desk and opened the drawer. Inside was a small leather-bound book with a brass clasp. He opened it. Bank book. Savings bank in town. Account opened February 1958. Single deposit $800. Evelyn took the bank book and looked at the entry. One line written in bank teller script. $800 deposited February the 3rd, 1958. 66 years, she said. That money has been sitting in a bank for 66 years. If the bank is still there, Henry said. Tommy spoke up from where he was kneeling beside the last stack of sheet music. It's still there, Main Street. My grandmother has her account there. The next morning, Henry put on the cleanest shirt he had and walked to the savings bank. Inside, a young woman named Diane looked at the bank book, typed the account number into her computer, typed it again, and picked up the phone. The bank manager was a man in his 60s named Bill Harmon. He sat Henry down in his office, closed the door, and turned his computer screen around. Mr. Marsh Clara Bellingham deposited $800 in 1958 with explicit instructions. The account was to remain open, earning interest, until someone presented the bank book and the accompanying letter. The account moved from basic savings to a certificate of deposit in 71, then into a conservative bond fund in 89. Every transition followed the original trust terms. Henry looked at the number on the screen. $127,000, Harmon said, and 41 cents. Henry sat back in his chair the way a man sits back when the ground beneath him has shifted and he needs a moment to find his balance. Clara specified 2 purposes for the funds: maintenance and restoration of the property at 14 Prosper Street and music education for those who need it most. The funds cannot be withdrawn for personal use, cannot be invested in other property, cannot be transferred. Henry walked home with the bank book in his jacket. Tommy was on the porch, sanding a railing post. Evelyn was beside him, reading one of Margaret's compositions in the morning light. She saw Henry's face and stood up. He told her the number. He told her the terms. Evelyn sat back down. She pressed both hands flat against her knees. $127,000 and 41 cents for the house and for music? For the house and for music. Tommy looked at them both. Is that enough to fix this place up for real? Henry did the math the way he'd done construction math for 40 years. Roof, electrical, plumbing to all 3 floors, paint, kitchen, bathrooms, foundation pointing, lumber at current prices, labor if they did most of it themselves. It's enough, he said. If we're careful, it's enough to do this right. The work changed after that. Henry stopped patching and started rebuilding. He drew plans on graph paper at the kitchen table, working from the house's original structure, mapped in his head. Tommy worked every morning, paid from the trust, at a fair hourly rate. They replaced the roof over 2 weeks, stripping old shingles down to the decking, replacing rotted boards, laying new felt and asphalt shingles that Dan from the hardware store ordered at cost. An electrician from the next town rewired the first 2 floors for half his normal rate. My grandmother played piano, he said. Can't say no to a story about a piano. The plumber from the church ran new copper lines to the second floor and wouldn't take payment. By the end of the third week, the Victorian had running water on 2 floors, electricity in every room, and a roof that didn't leak. Henry painted the exterior himself with Tommy on the ladder. Rose appeared with sandwiches and unsolicited opinions about the color. Not that blue. Clara's house was white with dark green trim. Evelyn nodded. I have the photograph from the library. They went with white and dark green. While the house came together board by board, Evelyn began to play. Every morning before the construction noise started, she climbed to the 3rd floor and worked through another composition. A piano tuner from the county seat spent 4 hours bringing the Steinway back to concert pitch. He charged $50 and asked if he could come back to hear someone play it. Margaret had organized her work in a progression. Basic pieces first, exercises for hands, rebuilding strength. Then intermediate compositions that demanded real skill while accommodating limited mobility. Then advanced work that required genuine musicianship. It was a curriculum, a complete method for teaching piano to people whose hands didn't work the way textbooks assumed. Evelyn played better each week. Her fingers would never be what they were at 40, but Margaret's music didn't ask them to be. It asked them to be what they were now, and it made something beautiful out of exactly that. Word got around the way word gets around in a town of 2,000. Somebody told somebody who told somebody else, and one Tuesday afternoon a woman knocked on the front door with a girl of about 11 standing behind hers. Are you the piano teacher? Evelyn hadn't called herself that in 5 years. I used to be. My daughter Sarah wants to learn. She's got a situation with her right hand. The woman paused. The girl held up her hand. The 3rd and 4th fingers were stiff and scarred of farming accident. We drove to 2 teachers in the county. Both said she'd never play properly. Then I heard about you and the music you found. Evelyn looked at the girl. The girl looked back at her with the stubborn expression of someone who had been told no and hadn't accepted it. Come in. She started Sarah on Margaret's beginning exercises that afternoon. Within 20 minutes, the girl was playing simple melodies with both hands. Her damaged fingers found the adapted positions, and the notes came clean and full. Sarah smiled for the first time since she'd walked through the door. Not a big smile, just a small shift around the eyes, the kind of smile that happens when you discover that the thing everybody said was impossible is actually just a different way of doing the same thing. 2 more students came that week, then 3 more. The retired farmer, whose hands were bent and stiff, the former school secretary, whose doctor had told her fine motor activities would slow the progression, a boy of 9 who had never touched a piano and didn't have damaged hands at all, just curiosity, and a mother who'd heard music coming from the 3rd floor windows. Evelyn taught in the parlor on a donated upright that Rosie's church had been keeping in a storage room. She reserved the Steinway for advanced work and for her own playing, which she did every evening when the students had gone home and the light changed in the 3rd floor windows. One evening Rose came by with dinner from the diner in a paper bag. She was halfway up the front walk when she stopped. Music was coming from the 3rd floor piano, slightly muffled by the old walls but unmistakable. She stood there with her hand pressed against her chest and listened. When she came inside, she walked past Henry without a word up the stairs to the 2nd floor, to the 3rd, through the broken wall into Margaret's room. Evelyn was playing a piece titled Letter to Someone I Haven't Met. Rose stood in the doorway. She was crying before she registered what she was seeing. Her voice came thick and quiet. "That's Margaret. I never heard her play, but my mother described it 100 times. She said it sounded like someone talking to you from a very long way off." Evelyn finished the piece. She lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. "It does." On a warm afternoon 3 weeks into the renovation, Henry was on the roof patching the last soft spot near the chimney. Tommy was below cutting trim pieces on the sawhorse in the side yard. The sun was high and the work was steady, and Henry had been up there since 7 in the morning. He stood to reposition the ladder, and the sky tilted. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in movies, just a slow, quiet rotation, as if someone had taken the horizon and tipped it 15 degrees to the left. His vision narrowed at the edges. His hands found the chimney, and he pressed himself flat against the warm brick and held on. The dizziness passed after maybe 10 seconds. He sat on the roof ridge and waited for his heartbeat to slow down. Below, Tommy looked up. "You all right up there?" "Fine. Sun got to me." Tommy watched him for a moment, then went back to cutting. Henry sat on the roof for another 5 minutes before he trusted his legs. He told himself it was the heat. It was probably the heat. He was 74, and he'd been working on a roof since dawn, and he hadn't drunk enough water. That was all. It happened again 2 days later, climbing the stairs to the 3rd floor. Halfway up the 2nd flight, the stairwell swam, and he grabbed the banister and stood there until the walls stopped moving. Evelyn was in the parlor teaching Sarah. She didn't see. That night, Henry sat on the porch alone after Evelyn had gone to bed. The level sat on the railing where Tommy had left it that afternoon. Henry picked it up and held it flat across his palm. The bubble sat perfectly centered between the lines. The porch was true. Every joint tight, every post plumb. He set the level back on the railing and looked at his hands. They were steady. They didn't shake. They still knew how to hold a hammer, read a joint, feel the grain of wood, and know whether it would hold weight. But something behind his eyes was not level. Something inside the framing was shifting, and he didn't know what it was, and he was not going to worry Evelyn about it. Not now. Not when she had just found the piano and the students and the reason to sit down at the keys every morning. He went to bed and didn't mention it. 3 days later, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. Henry was on the porch replacing a section of decorative trim. A man got out of the driver's side, tall, mid-40s, dark suit, no tie. His hair was shorter than the last time Henry had seen him. He'd lost weight, but Henry would have known him from 100 yards away. Garrett. A woman got out of the passenger side, blazer leather portfolio, nobody Henry recognized. Garrett walked up the front path. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at the house, the fresh paint, the rebuilt porch, the repaired windows, the clean gutters. His expression shifted the way a man's expression shifts when he realizes he's underestimated something. Dead? Garrett. The place looks different. The place is different. Tommy was kneeling by the railing with a sanding block. He looked at Garrett, then at Henry, and stayed where he was. Henry looked at the woman with the portfolio. "Who's your friend?" "She's an associate, historic property assessment." "Did she come to assess the property?" Garrett put his hands in his pockets, the same gesture he'd made as a teenager when he was about to ask for something he knew he shouldn't. Henry recognized it immediately, the way you recognize a crack in a wall you've been watching for years. "Dad, can we talk inside?" They sat at the kitchen table. Evelyn came down from the third floor when she heard Garrett's voice. She stood in the doorway and didn't sit. "Mom?" "Garrett." He looked at her for a moment, then looked away. He turned to Henry. "I heard about the house, what you found up there, the piano, the music, the bank account. It was in the county paper. A friend forwarded it to me." Evelyn's voice came even measured, without warmth. "A friend." Garrett shifted in his chair. "Look, I came because I think there's an opportunity here. This house with the story attached to it, with the historic designation it's going to qualify for, it's worth real money. The property alone is worth $200,000 on the low end, with the media attention more. I know a developer who would make an offer this week." The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. "I have a comfortable place," Henry said. "Dad, you're 74 years old. You're living in a house you bought for $12. Evelyn pulled a chair out and sat down across from her son. She placed her hands on the table, flat palms down her swollen knuckles and stiff fingers visible under the kitchen light. She let him see them. "Garrett, do you remember when I stopped teaching piano? Your hands, Mom, the arthritis. Do you know what you said to me when I told you I couldn't teach anymore?" Garrett didn't answer. "You said, well, it's not like it was paying the bills anyway. That's what you said to your mother the week she lost the thing that mattered most to her in the world." Garrett looked at the table. "And you gave my piano to the movers, $75 at the second-hand shop on Route 9. They remembered you, Garrett." She folded her hands. "And you sold my mother's wedding ring. You took it from my jewelry box the day before the house closed. You drove to a pawn shop on Meridian Street and sold it for $400. I know because I called every pawn shop within 50 miles. The one on Meridian remembered you." Garrett's face had gone white. Not red, not angry. White, the color of a man watching the floor give way beneath him. "That ring was the only thing I had left of my mother," Evelyn said. "And you sold it for $400 because you thought I wouldn't notice or I wouldn't care or it didn't matter because I was just your mother. And mothers don't get to have things that matter." She placed her hands flat on the table again. The swollen joints, the fingers that couldn't reach an octave, the hands that had taught 1,000 students and raised 3 children, and now finally had found music written for exactly their shape. "This house is not for sale, Garrett. Margaret's music is not for sale, and we are not going anywhere." Garrett stood. His associate stood. He walked to the front door and paused with his hand on the knob. Henry followed him onto the porch. "Garrett." His son stopped on the front walk. He didn't turn. Henry's voice came steady, without anger, without pleading, just a door held open. "When you're ready to be my son again, the door is open." Garrett stood there. Then he got in his car. His associate got in the other side. They drove away without looking back. Tommy was still kneeling by the railing. His sanding block was in his hand, forgotten. "You all right?" Henry looked at the spot where the car had been. "Yeah, I'm all right." He sat on the porch step and let the afternoon settle around him the way sawdust settles after a long day of cutting, slowly, quietly, covering everything in a fine layer that you don't notice until the light catches it. That evening, Evelyn played longer than usual. She played Margaret's compositions one after another, the ones she'd memorized and the ones she still read from the page. The third-floor windows were open for the first time, and the music drifted out into the warm evening air. Tommy heard it from his grandmother's porch. He sat on the steps and listened. Rose heard it locking up the diner. She stood on the sidewalk with the keys in her hand. A woman from 2 houses over came out onto her porch. A man across the street. A couple walking their dog stopped on the sidewalk. One by one, people came out of their houses or paused on the street and listened to the music coming from the Victorian that everyone used to call Haunted. 7 people stood in the yard by the time Evelyn stopped. They didn't clap. They didn't say anything. They stood in the last light of the day, listening to the silence after the music ended, the way you listen to the space after a bell stops ringing, because something in that silence still holds the shape of the sound. The next morning, Henry found a note under the front door. No signature, just a sentence in pencil on lined paper. My mother played that song. I didn't know anyone still could. He put the note in the kitchen drawer and didn't mention it to anyone. The professor from the State University arrived on a Saturday. She wore cotton gloves and handled each page of Margaret's music with the care of someone who understood that she was touching something irreplaceable. She photographed every composition, front and back. She read Clara's letter 3 times. At the end of the day, she sat in the parlor with a cup of Rose's coffee. I've spent my career studying adaptive music pedagogy. The field barely existed before the 1970s. What Margaret Bellingham wrote in this room between 1955 and 1958 predates all of it. She wasn't just composing music, she was inventing a method that the rest of the world wouldn't arrive at for another 20 years. Several of these are genuinely beautiful pieces in their own right. With your permission, I'd like to bring a colleague to evaluate the collection for publication. Evelyn looked at the letter in its envelope on the desk. Clara wanted the music to live. So yes, 2 days later, the county sent a letter. Henry opened it at the kitchen table. Official letterhead, County Building and Safety Division. He read it twice, then set it down and pressed his palms flat against the table the way Evelyn had pressed hers during the conversation with Garrett, hands down steadying himself against a surface that wasn't moving but felt like it should be. The house at 14 Prosper Street had been inspected remotely, satellite imagery, public records, a complaint filed by an unnamed party, and found to be in violation of County Building Code. The condemnation order from 1991 had never been formally lifted. Renovations had been conducted without permits. Structural certification had not been filed by a licensed active engineer. Henry was a licensed structural engineer, but his license had lapsed 6 years ago when he retired. He could read a house the way some people read faces. He could feel rot through a wall with his fingertips, but he could not sign the certification the county required because the piece of paper that said he was allowed to had expired while he was busy losing everything else. The letter gave them 30 days. Submit a structural certification signed by an active licensed engineer or the county would issue a demolition order 30 days. The cost of hiring an outside engineer for a full structural assessment ran $8,000 to $12,000. The trust fund couldn't cover it. Clara's terms specified maintenance and music education, not engineering fees. Henry had called the bank to ask. Harmon's answer was gentle but firm. The trust language was specific, and he couldn't authorize a disbursement outside its scope. Henry didn't tell Evelyn about the letter that night. She was upstairs teaching Sarah, and he could hear the sound of the girl's damaged fingers finding Margaret's notes through the floorboards, and he couldn't bring himself to put this weight on top of that sound. He sat on the porch in the dark and held the level across his knees. The bubble sat centered. The porch was true, but the ground underneath it, the legal ground, the bureaucratic ground, the paper ground that determined whether this house was allowed to keep standing, that ground was not level at all. The complaint had been filed by an unnamed party. Henry didn't need a name. He put the level back on the railing and went to bed. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning, Henry was carrying a stack of trim boards up the interior staircase to the second floor. He was on the 7th step when the stairwell rotated again, not slowly this time, not the gentle tilt he'd felt on the roof. This time the world folded sideways like a page being turned, and his hands couldn't find the banister fast enough, and the boards went clattering down the stairs, and Henry went with them. Tommy was in the kitchen. He heard the crash and came running. Henry was on the landing between the first and second floors, sitting against the wall with his eyes closed and his hands flat on the floor on either side of him, as if he were trying to hold the house still. "Mr. Marsh, I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're sitting on the floor." "I tripped." "You didn't trip. I heard you fall. That's a different sound." Henry opened his eyes. The stairwell had stopped spinning. Tommy was crouching in front of him, with a look on his face that Henry had never seen before, not concern exactly something closer to the expression of a person who has been watching a crack in a wall for weeks and has just seen it widen. "How long has this been happening?" Tommy asked. Henry didn't answer. "How long, Mr. Marsh?" "A few weeks. It comes and goes. The heat, it's October." Henry looked at Tommy. The boy was 17 years old, and he'd been taking care of his grandmother since he was 16, and he knew what it looked like when someone was hiding a thing their body was telling them. Tommy called the ambulance. Henry argued against it from the floor of the stairwell. He was still arguing when the paramedics loaded him onto the stretcher, and he stopped arguing only when Evelyn came down from the 3rd floor and stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at him the way she had looked at the piano bench on their first night, with the face of a woman seeing something she loved in a place it was not supposed to be. The hospital was 20 minutes away. The doctor was young and direct. Hypertension, severe. Blood pressure numbers that made the doctor pause before saying them out loud, combined with weeks of physical labor, dehydration, and stress. No ladders, no roofs, no heavy lifting. If you'd fallen from the roof instead of the stairs, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Henry lay in the hospital bed and looked at his hands on the white sheet. Hands that had rebuilt the porch. Hands that had stripped the roof and laid new shingles. Hands that had held the level for Tommy and the chisel for the sealed wall and the letter from a woman who had been dead for 60 years. His hands were still. The machines beeped. Evelyn sat in the chair beside the bed and held his right hand in both of hers. Her swollen fingers wrapped around his rough ones, 2 sets of damaged hands holding each other in a room that smelled like antiseptic and fluorescent light. She didn't ask why he hadn't told her. She already knew. The same reason she hadn't told him about the wedding ring for 3 weeks after she found out. The same reason Clara had left the key above the door instead of throwing it away. There are things you can't say out loud because saying them makes them real, and sometimes you need a little more time before you're ready for that. The county letter sat on the kitchen table at home, 27 days left. Henry lay in the hospital bed, 3 days minimum, and the house on Prosper Street stood on its good bones with no one to sign the paper that said it was allowed to keep standing. Evelyn didn't sleep the first night Henry was in the hospital. She sat in the kitchen with Clara's letter spread on the table in front of her, and the county notice beside it, and the list Henry had written on the back of the auction receipt, his handwriting small and precise, every task numbered, every measurement double-checked. She read through the list the way she used to read through a new piece of music, not playing it yet, just learning where the difficult passages were. The list was long, the county deadline was short, and the man who had carried this house on his back for 2 months was lying in a hospital bed 20 minutes away with machines tracking every beat of his heart. She picked up the phone and called Rose. Rose arrived at 6 in the morning with coffee and no questions. She sat across from Evelyn and listened while Evelyn laid out the problem, the county letter, the lapsed license, the 30-day deadline that was now 27 days, the cost of an outside engineer that the trust couldn't cover. Rose poured a second cup. Who do we know? Nobody. Henry knows engineers from his career, but they're all upstate. A full assessment and certification from someone that far away would cost more than we have. What about the university, the professor who came to see the music? Evelyn looked at Rose across the table. Rose looked back at her with the expression of a woman who had been solving problems with limited resources for 30 years, one customer at a time. Evelyn called the professor that morning. She explained the situation, the county order, the deadline, the lapsed license. She didn't ask for a favor. She stated the facts the way Henry would have stated them, clear and measured, without self-pity. The professor was quiet for a moment. Then she said she'd make some calls. Tommy came to the house at 7, same as every morning. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the county letter on the table. What do we do? Evelyn handed him Henry's list. We keep working. Every item on this list that we can finish before the inspection makes the inspector's job easier. We can't sign the paper, but we can make sure the house is ready for whoever does. Tommy took the list. He read it through, folded it, and put it in his back pocket. I'll start with the second-floor bathroom. Mr. Marsh wanted the tile reset before anything else up there. He paused at the door. Mrs. Marsh, is he going to be okay? Evelyn looked at Tommy. He was 17 years old. He had dropped out of school to care for his grandmother. He had learned to hold a level and read a joint and shim a quarter-inch. And now he was standing in the kitchen of a house he'd helped rebuild, asking if the man who taught him those things was going to be all right. He's going to be fine, Evelyn said. He just needs to stop climbing on roofs. Tommy almost smiled. He went upstairs. Evelyn spent the morning organizing. She called the plumber from the church and asked if he could finish the third-floor bathroom connection that Henry had started. She called Dan at the hardware store and explained that Henry was in the hospital and the work would continue, and the account was still good. Dan didn't ask a single question. He said the order Henry had placed last week was ready for pickup, and he'd have Tommy's supplies set aside by noon. She visited Henry that afternoon. He was sitting up in bed, arguing with a nurse about salt intake. "The county letter," he said as soon as Evelyn walked in. "I know about the county letter. My license. I know about your license. Evie, if we can't get a certified engineer in there within 30 days. Henry," she sat in the chair beside his bed and placed her hand on his arm. "I have been married to you for 51 years. I watched you build a career. I raised 3 children, 2 of whom turned out to be a disappointment, and I have spent the last 2 months learning to play piano again on a dead girl's Steinway. I can handle a county building inspector." Henry looked at her. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the foundation of the Victorian on the first day, assessing, calculating, and then arriving at a conclusion he already knew. "The bones are good," he said. "The bones are good." The call came on a Thursday, 5 days after Henry went to the hospital. The professor had found someone, a structural engineer licensed and active in the state of Ohio, willing to do the assessment at no charge. His name was Arthur Colton. He was 35, still young for a firm of his own, but he'd built a reputation in historic preservation across the state, and when Evelyn heard the name, she sat down on the piano bench in the parlor and pressed her hand against her mouth. Arthur Colton had been her student 25 years ago. He was 10 when he started lessons, a quiet boy with big hands and no natural talent for music. He came every Wednesday for 3 years. He never got past the intermediate level. He never won a competition. He quit when he was 13, and Evelyn hadn't heard from him since. He drove to Caulfield on a Saturday morning. He was tall the way boys who were tall at 10 tend to become tall men. He wore work boots and carried a clipboard and a laser level that cost more than Henry's entire tool kit. Evelyn met him on the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at the house the way Henry had on the first day reading it. "Mrs. Marsh, Arthur, it's been a long time. 25 years. He shifted the clipboard to his other hand. "I wasn't a very good pianist. You were a dedicated one. You told me something once. I was 13. I just botched a recital in front of my parents, and I wanted to quit. You said the question isn't whether you're good enough. The question is whether you'll sit back down at the bench tomorrow." Evelyn remembered not the specific day, but the words, because she'd said them to dozens of students over the years. Sit back down at the bench. It was the only advice she'd ever believed in. "I applied that to everything," Arthur said. "Engineering school, my licensing exam, building my firm. Every time I wanted to quit, I heard your voice telling me to sit back down." He looked at the porch, at the railing, at the trim work Tommy had cut and fitted. Who did this work, though? A 74-year-old retired engineer and a 17-year-old boy who'd never held a level before he came here. Arthur ran his hand along the railing the way Henry ran his hand along a joint, reading it. "It's good work." He spent 6 hours inspecting the house. Every floor, every wall, every beam, every joint. He tested the foundation with instruments Henry didn't own. He checked the electrical and the plumbing and the roof. He crawled under the porch and into the attic and spent 30 minutes in the cellar with a moisture meter. At the end of the day, he sat at the kitchen table and filled out the certification form. 3 pages. He signed each one with a pen he'd brought from his office. "The structure is sound. The renovations meet code. I'm recommending the condemnation order be formally lifted." He paused. "Whoever did this work, the framing, the joints, the load distribution, it's textbook. Better than textbook. It's the kind of work you only see from someone who understands why a building stands not just how at." Evelyn looked at the signed pages on the table. She looked at Arthur Colton, the boy who couldn't play piano, who had carried her words in his pocket for 25 years and brought them back to her at the exact moment she needed them. "Thank you, Arthur. Don't thank me. You taught me to sit back down." Henry came home 2 days later. The doctor had adjusted his medication and delivered a list of restrictions that Henry listened to with the expression of a man being told the rules to a game he didn't intend to play. He walked up the front steps, slowly, one at a time, holding the railing Tommy had built. He stepped onto the porch and stood there. The house was standing. The paint was fresh. The windows caught the October light. Through the open third-floor windows, he could hear the faint sound of the Steinway Evelyn had been playing that morning and hadn't closed the fallboard. On the porch railing, right where Tommy always left it, sat the level. Henry picked it up. The bubble sat centered between the lines. Tommy came around the side of the house with a paintbrush in his hand. He saw Henry on the porch and stopped. "Mr. Marsh?" "Tommy." "I checked it every morning, the level, every morning since you went to the hospital." Henry looked at the level in his hand. He looked at Tommy. He set the level back on the railing carefully, deliberately, exactly where it had been. "I know you did." That evening, Evelyn told Henry about Arthur Colton. She told him the whole story, the piano lessons, the botched recital, the words she'd said 25 years ago that she barely remembered, but that had traveled through a boy's life and landed back at her door when the house needed saving. Henry was quiet for a long time. "You saved this house, Evie. A lot of people saved this house. But you picked up the phone. You asked for help. You kept working." I sat back down at the bench. Henry put his arm around her. They sat on the porch step, the same spot, and watched the stars come out over Prosper Street. The phone call came on a Tuesday. Evelyn was in the kitchen washing dishes after a lesson. Her cell phone buzzed on the counter. Unfamiliar number, familiar area code. "Mom?" Their second son. 5 months of silence broken by that single syllable. "Mom, it's me. I saw the article about the house." Evelyn leaned against the counter and closed her eyes. "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I should have called the day Garrett told me what he'd done. I should have driven over and picked you up. I didn't, because it was easier not to, because Garrett handled everything and I let him, and by the time I understood what had happened, it felt too late." Evelyn's hand tightened on the phone. Through the kitchen window she could see Henry in the side yard stacking scrap lumber for the neighbor who used it as firewood. Slow now, careful. No lifting anything over 20 pounds, the doctor had said. "Can I come see the house? I don't need to stay. I just want to see what you've built. I want to hear you play." Evelyn watched Henry through the glass. He was holding a piece of scrap wood, turning it over, deciding if it was worth saving. "It's always been your house, too. Come Saturday. Bring nothing, just yourself." She hung up. She didn't cry. She'd done enough crying in this house. 2 weeks later, a plain white envelope arrived in the mail. No letter, no return address. Inside, a check in Garrett's handwriting. The amount was generous. The memo line was blank. Henry sat at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. He folded it carefully and walked upstairs to Margaret's room. He lifted the lid of the piano bench and placed the check inside, next to the yellowed cloth that had been there since the first night. He closed the lid. There are things that sit in piano benches. Old cloth, unsigned, checks the memory of hands that once played and hands that will play again. Things that are waiting to be understood. The bench is a patient place. It doesn't rush. The spring recital was held on the first Saturday in May. Evelyn had her students prepare one composition each, all from Margaret's catalogue. The parlor held 40 folding chairs borrowed from the church, and every seat was taken. A dozen more people stood along the walls and in the foyer. Tommy's grandmother sat in the front row, with her oxygen tank beside her. Rose sat next to her, the electrician, the plumber, the neighbor who'd brought the tomatoes. The librarian came with a framed copy of the 1954 newspaper clipping which she presented to Evelyn before the recital began. The students played one by one. The 9-year-old boy went first. A piece called Morning Walk, played slowly and steadily, both hands flat and careful, the way someone crosses a creek on stepping stones, one note at a time, trusting each one to hold. The retired farmer played a piece called What the Hands Remember. His stiff fingers found every note. When he finished, he looked at his hands on the keys as though he were seeing them for the first time. His voice came low and rough, not to anyone in particular. This girl who died before I was born wrote this music for exactly these hands. Sarah played for Hands That Remember, the same piece Evelyn had sight-read the day they opened the sealed room. Sarah played it clean and strong and without hesitation, her scarred fingers moving across the keys with the confidence of someone who had been told no and had answered by sitting back down at the bench every single day until no didn't apply anymore. The room was quiet when she finished, not polite quiet, the kind of quiet that means something has shifted in the air, something that everyone in the room can feel, but nobody needs to name. Evelyn played last. She played Letter to Someone I Haven't Met, the most complex composition in the collection, written in Margaret's final months. She played it from memory, her eyes closed, her swollen hands moving across the keys with a certainty that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with knowing exactly where each note lived, because a girl who died at 19 had placed each one where damaged hands could find it. The melody filled the parlor and rose through the staircase to the 3rd floor, where the door to Margaret's room stood open and the afternoon light came through the clean windows and fell across the empty desk where Clara's letter had sat for 60 years. When Evelyn finished, nobody moved. Then Rose started clapping and the room followed, and the sound traveled through the house the way the music had upward, outward, through the bones and the beams and the good oak framing that had held this place together for more than a century. After the recital, people stayed. They ate pie Rose had baked and drank coffee from the percolator the church had loaned. They walked through the house and looked at the photographs on the walls, Clara and Margaret the Victorian in its original colors, and they read Clara's letter in its frame in the waiting room upstairs. Henry stood on the front porch with a cup of coffee and watched. A boy of about 12 came out the front door and ran down the steps. He stopped on the sidewalk and looked up at the house, at the tower, at the 3rd floor windows, where the curtains moved in the breeze. My mom says this used to be the haunted house. Henry looked at the windows. He could hear Evelyn inside, her voice warm and easy, talking to someone about fingering positions. He could hear the murmur of people in the parlor, the clink of coffee cups. And underneath all of it, faint but steady, the sound of someone running a scale on the upright in the teaching studio, one of the students practicing, not wanting to stop. "It's not haunted," Henry said. "It was just waiting." The boy looked at him, shrugged, the way 12-year-olds shrug at things they'll understand later, and ran off down the sidewalk. Henry sat on the porch step, the same step where Rose had brought the muffins, the same step where Garrett had walked away, the same step where he and Evelyn had eaten cheese and apples on their first night, and watched the stars come out over a street they'd never seen before and had no reason to find, except that every other direction had someone standing in it who didn't want them. The porch was solid, every joint tight. He could feel it in the boards beneath him, the steadiness of a thing that had been put back together by hands that cared about getting it right. The level sat on the railing. The bubble sat centered. Tommy had checked it that morning the way he checked it every morning now, a habit that had become as natural as breathing, passed from an old man's hands to a young man's hands, the way music passes from a teacher to a student. Not by instruction alone, but by the daily, ordinary act of showing up and doing the work. The third-floor windows were open. Evelyn had gone back upstairs. Margaret's music drifted out over the street, over the elms, over the yard where the dogwood trees the garden club had donated were just beginning to bloom white blossoms, catching the late afternoon light, each one small and ordinary, and taken together enough to change the color of the whole yard. Down the block, a woman came out onto her porch. A man across the street paused by his mailbox. Tommy sat on his grandmother's steps, 4 houses down, his cap off his face, turned toward the sound. The music carried. It always had. It carried when Margaret played it 60 years ago on summer evenings with the windows open and people stopped on the sidewalk to listen. It carried now through the same windows, played by different hands, older hands, stiffer hands that had lost what they once had, and found something new written exactly for what remained. Just a house, good bones, an open door, music through the windows. And the music had never stopped. It had just been waiting for the right hands to find it. If you've ever been told that your best years are behind you, that the thing you loved is over, that your hands can't do what they used to do, I want you to think about Evelyn sitting down at that piano, and Margaret writing music at 19 for people she would never meet, and Clara leaving a key above the door because she couldn't quite bring herself to lock it all away forever. Let me know in the comments, what is the thing you thought you'd lost that turned out to be waiting for you to come back to it?